Okay, so I'm seeing a Diplomats, Mystery Illness, and Pulse Radio Frequency Microwave Radiation. Next slide. So for those of you who are distant from your high school physics, electromagnetic radiation travels in waves, and these are characterized by their frequency, the number of cycles that pass a point per second, which is measured in hertz. And the fat arrow shows different types of electromagnetic radiation, from low frequency to high frequency, from the extremely low frequency power line type radiation up through radio frequency, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray. And the energy of radiation is proportional to the frequency described by the equation E equals h nu, so that higher frequencies produce higher energy, and at high enough frequencies, this energy is sufficient to dislodge an electron from an atom, a phenomenon that is known as ionization. So the higher frequencies of radiation from ultraviolet on up are referred to as ionizing radiation, and the lower frequencies as non-ionizing. But just because radiation is ionizing does not mean that that is what is responsible for their adverse effects. And in fact, most of the data on mechanism of adverse effects of ionizing radiation refers not to ionization, but to oxidative stress, which also occurs with non-ionizing radiation. And the damage does not have to be assumed to be necessarily due exclusively to the energy. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that RF, or radio frequency radiation, goes from around 3,000 cycles per second, or 3 kilohertz, up to 300 billion cycles per second. By the way, the lower end of this range differs from source to source. And microwave radiation is a subset of radio frequency radiation. It's the high end of the radio frequency range, from 300 million to 300 billion cycles per second. Next slide. So radiation is not the same thing as sound, although in selected settings, radiation can produce the perception of sound. Radiation and sound both travel by waves, although radiation are what are called transverse waves, meaning that the direction of variation is perpendicular to the direction of travel, while sound waves, which are pressure waves, are longitudinal waves, which means that the direction of variation in pressure is in the direction of travel. But although these are different, they're both characterized in cycles per second or hertz, and radiation can produce the perception of sound, a phenomenon that goes by a number of different names. It's called the Frey Effect after Alan Frey's 1961 paper, or RF hearing, microwave hearing, or the microwave auditory effect, although it does occur in parts of the RF range outside the microwave range. Specifically, this phenomenon occurs exclusively with pulse radiation, and in the frequency range of 2.4 million to 10 billion cycles per second. And in the interest of time, I'll skip the mechanism that underlies this, and we'll go to the next slide. And what matters is not the mechanism, but the fact that noises that are produced by RF differ in characteristics from those that are produced by sound. And we can look at the characteristics that were reported for sounds heard by diplomats and compare them to those expected for RF or for sound. So first off, different diplomats heard different noises, and this would not be expected for a sound source, but would be expected for an RF source, because the noises that are heard depend not only on pulse characteristics, but also on head dimensions. So they differ for different people. The second issue is the character of the noises that were heard, which were described as chirping, clanging, clicking, grinding, and hissing, all of which are part of the spectrum of noises produced by RF. So it's these noises that would be expected if RF were the source. And there's no particular reason why it would be these noises if the source were a sound source. Third, the Frey effect can only be heard in settings of low ambient noise, and it was reported that these noises were heard by diplomats virtually exclusively at night. There's no reason why that would be the case if it were a sound source, but there is an RF source, and indeed had it not been the case that these were heard virtually exclusively at night or in settings of low ambient noise, this would have essentially excluded the RF hypothesis. Next, it was reported that these noises had laser-like localization in space, which media reported to, quote, defy known physics. Well, this may defy the physics of sound, but it does not defy the physics of electromagnetic radiation. Indeed, lasers are electromagnetic radiation. Fifth, it was reported that within the territory in which the sounds were heard, they seemed to follow people as they walked. Now, actual sound from a fixed source does not seem to follow people. In fact, we have the, quote, superior alveolar nucleus in the brain that helps to localize the origin of sound in space. But RF-induced Frey effects do seem to follow people because these are produced inside the head. They're typically perceived as just behind the head, but in some people as inside the head or just above the head. But in whichever place they're heard, this is irrespective of the orientation and position of the person relative to the source of radiation, and the sound seems to follow them as they move, again, within the area where it's heard. And finally, 5 Cuban diplomats each reported that when they covered their ears or head, there was the striking finding that there was no apparent attenuation in the intensity of the noise. This would not be expected for sound, which will attenuate with covering the ears, but it is expected for RF-induced Frey effects. In fact, covering the ears by reducing ambient noise can in some settings even intensify the sound. So each of these characteristics of the noises are predictions of radio frequency. None are predictions of sound, none are expectations of sound, and several are frankly incompatible with it. Indeed, there is no other known thing besides pulsed RF that can produce these noise features. And this essentially compels pulsed RF as the cause. Now, I'll take a second to comment on the fact that there was briefly a report that noises had been recorded, and it was immediately obvious what this was. In fact, locals who also heard the noises said that they sounded like crickets that were abundant in that area of Cuba, and all the noises were the same. 15 recordings were brought by the FBI to specialists. They were all said to be the same thing. They all sounded like crickets chirping, and ultimately spectral analysis showed that, in fact, these were the sounds of the Caribbean cricket. So just as the Frey effect can sound like crickets chirping, so can crickets chirping. And there's nothing about the ability to record crickets chirping that in any way excludes the Frey effect from having been present. Next slide. So we can also compare the symptoms reported by the diplomats in the Swanson study to symptoms reported by those experiencing non-ionizing radiation toxicity. Now, with ultraviolet radiation, we refer to toxicity as phototoxicity, and people who experience this toxicity at significantly lower levels of radiation than other people do are referred to as photosensitive. Similarly, with medical radiation, we refer to toxicity as radiotoxicity, but confusing because it's not just radiofrequency radiation, but just radiation. And for people who experience this at much lower levels than others, we refer to them as radiosensitive. Similarly, a group of people that experience toxicity from non-ionizing radiation at levels that are not a problem for other people, and these individuals are referred to as electrosensitive. So we can compare the rates of symptoms in diplomats to symptoms in a study of electrosensitive people in Japan published in 2012, and we see that there's close concordance of symptoms, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. Headache, 81%, 81%. Cognitive problems, 81%, 81%. Sleep problems, dizziness, tinnitus, irritability, and anxiety. In each case, very close concordance quantitatively, not just qualitatively. Now, there isn't any other known condition that produces these symptoms in this profile. These are, by and large, quote, non-specific symptoms, which means that many different organic causes will produce these symptoms, but not in this profile. For example, any oxidative stressor can produce each of these symptoms. But each one has their own characteristic profile based on where that, for example, toxin goes in the body and its other characteristics. And what's particularly striking about both electrosensitivity and the diplomats' problems are the prominence of sleep problems and auditory problems, such as tinnitus, ear pain, and hearing loss, which are reported both in electrosensitivity and in diplomats. And this may be because both of effects of radiofrequency radiation and melatonin, which I'll hope to briefly discuss in terms of the sleep problems, and also because the mode of entry into the brain is through the skull, and there's no skull barrier at the point of the ear. I'll comment also briefly on the idea of social contagion. Well, first of all, the diplomats can't have followed the electrosensitive people with any likelihood because there was no attention to microwave radiation as a source of this injury at the time that these symptoms were elicited. And also, they would have had to actually collude with one another because these percentages are percentages that are across groups of people and are matched from group to group. So in any case, again, there is nothing else that fits this profile of symptoms. And again, this essentially compels electromagnetic radiation as the cause. Next slide. So potentially objectively measured signs, in some cases actually objectively measured, in some cases reported, are also in common between diplomats and those with non-ionizing radiation toxicity. And these data are across a number of different studies that you can see in my published paper. But hearing loss, vision problems, speech and balance problems, nosebleed, brain swelling, and white matter damage are reported in both groups or in subsets of both groups. And in both cases, initial studies were brain MRI were reported to look like traumatic brain injury. In both cases, it was also commented that some individuals had past head injury, which there was reason to think could be a predisposing factor to non-ionizing radiation toxicity, but others had not had past head injury. So the signs are also a fit to radiofrequency radiation. Next slide. If it weren't enough that the noises only fit pulsed RF, and the symptoms are only a fit to non-ionizing radiation toxicity, and the signs are also a fit, there's also precedent for past use of radiofrequency microwave radiation in U.S. diplomats in a foreign embassy setting, specifically in Moscow, where the embassy is known to have been microwaved from 1953 to the latter 1980s or early 1990s, depending on the source. Now, the chief hypotheses at the time were either intentional harm or surveillance, or Russia has also said that the actual purpose was jamming of others' surveillance devices. And in fact, surveillance is well known to be possible using microwaves, so-called TTW, or through-the-wall surveillance, which can occur through any wall material up to and including concrete, except for metal, and which can detect movements as fine as the movements of breathing or of lips for purposes of lip reading. This is all in open source literature. Incidentally, there was a study commissioned, a study by Lilienfeld at Johns Hopkins University to study the Moscow diplomats, but unfortunately they weren't evaluated until years after they had returned from Moscow. And as we know from the literature on non-ionizing radiation toxicity, and as we've already seen from the diplomats in Cuba and China, there's recovery with time away from the exposure. Nonetheless, those symptoms that were still years later elevated in excess are a close match, which were, by the way, a tiny fraction, are a close match to the symptoms that are reported acutely in the Swanson paper. Next slide. So what is the potential mechanism for this? Well, we alluded early on to oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is that kind of free radical injury that antioxidants help to protect against that causes damage to lipids, protein, DNA, RNA, and also to mitochondria, which are the energy-producing elements of cells. So mitochondria are inherited only from the mother, and they have their own special mitochondrial DNA inherited only from the mother. This is a bacterial-type circular DNA, and it is much more vulnerable to oxidative injury, both because of where a lot of oxidative stress is produced and because they have less effective repair mechanisms than nuclear DNA. And so cell energy impairment is a not uncommon consequence of oxidative stress, and mitochondrial damage is both an effect and a cause of oxidative stress. So the evidence that oxidative stress is caused by radiofrequency radiation and in turn contributes to adverse effects of radiofrequency radiation is abundant, strongly replicated, and powerfully triangulated. By replication, I refer to the setting where a similar exposure occurs, a similar outcome is examined, and similar results are produced. By triangulation, I refer to the setting where the same problem is looked at from different angles, producing converging results. So Yakimenko is an excellent example of replication. Yakimenko examined 100 articles, each of which asked the question of whether low-intensity radiofrequency radiation caused oxidative stress. 93 of the studies found that it did. So this is abundantly replicated and also refutes those kinds of claims that, the bulk of the evidence shows no problem with radiofrequency radiation. So the remainder of the examples that I'm giving here refer to triangulation. For example, DeLuca examined people with electrosensitivity and found that they had tenfold elevated odds of having a gene profile that confers impaired defense against oxidative stress. That is to say, these people that are sensitive at lower levels of non-ionizing radiation show impaired defense against the main mechanism of harm from non-ionizing radiation, so it makes sense that they would experience problems at lower levels. Belton evaluated 675 people with electrosensitivity in France and found that sizable subsets of them had each of a number of mechanisms that oxidative stress promotes, but the common finding was depressed levels of a critical antioxidant that can, in a subgroup of people, be depressed by radiation, specifically melatonin. Now, this also brings up the point that antioxidants, but by the way, there are literally scores or hundreds of studies showing that melatonin protects against radiation injury for radiofrequency microwave radiation, but also, in fact, for radiation across the electromagnetic spectrum, whether it is ionizing or non-ionizing, and for non-ionizing radiation, whether or not it exceeds the so-called thermal limit. That is to say, whether it causes heating sufficient that the heating could be responsible for the other problems or symptoms. And so this fact that antioxidants protect against damage from radiofrequency radiation is further triangulation that oxidative stress is a mediator for this phenomenon. Next slide. So what are some of the downstream mechanisms that oxidative stress promotes? And these are downstream mechanisms that have been shown with oxidative stress not just in the setting of radiofrequency radiation, but in a number of other settings that have also been shown to be consequences of radiofrequency radiation. These include mitochondrial injury, alterations in voltage-gated calcium channels, increases in inflammation, and increases in autoimmunity. So oxidative stress modifies substances in the body in a fashion that makes them more vulnerable to autoimmune attack. And interestingly, the Belpom study in France found that around 20% of electrosensitive people had antibodies for O-myelin. So it isn't only the case that their increased vulnerability to oxidative stress may promote autoimmunity, but that impaired insulating sheaths over the conducting nerve fibers might potentially contribute to the brain symptoms that these individuals experience. On the right, we'll see that the downstream mechanisms of oxidative stress also include damage to membranes, impairments to blood flow, increases in programmed cell death or apoptosis, and also damage to the blood-brain barrier that normally excludes potentially toxic substances from the brain. So these are all mechanisms that can then contribute to health effects. And it should be mentioned that the literature on these is not 100% consistent, but there are reasons why we don't expect that it should be. First, and we'll mention one of these mechanisms in a minute, which is the phenomenon of oxidative preconditioning, but also you have to get the timing right. You have to have allowed adequate timing for the oxidative stress to first occur and then promote the downstream phenomena. And it also requires that you have the timing where it remains pro-oxidant rather than antioxidant, which is what we'll discuss now. So one thing that looks to be inconsistent in the RF literature, but also looks to be inconsistent in literature about other pro-oxidants, is what happens to antioxidant defenses. In some studies, these seem to go up, in some they seem to go down. Well, this is because of a phenomenon termed oxidative preconditioning, in which low amounts of pro-oxidants, in other words, healthy individuals, can lead to adaptive upregulation of native antioxidant defenses. But unfortunately, in individuals whose antioxidant systems are already overwhelmed, and incidentally, this commonly is people with existing mitochondrial damage, which can be from, by the way, other exposures. In these individuals, they can't upregulate antioxidant defenses and simply have their antioxidants consumed by the addition of further oxidative stress, and so the levels are depressed. So these phenomena, again, depending on the timing of the study, contribute to the apparent inconsistencies in the literature on these downstream mechanisms, but nonetheless, each of them have ample replication with radiofrequency radiation. Next slide. So we alluded to the phenomenon of mitochondrial injury, and there are many studies showing that oxidative stress promotes mitochondrial injury, many studies showing that radiofrequency radiation promotes mitochondrial injury. So I selected this study even though it uses millimeter wave radiation, which is the top of the frequency range of the microwave range, and I selected that because it looks at live animals exposed over time. So millimeter waves are outside of the range that produce the Frey effect, so there's no particular reason to think that people are exposed to millimeter waves. But of course, we only know that they had to have been exposed to radiation within the range that produces the Frey effect. We can't say that they were necessarily not exposed to radiation outside that range. But in any case, this particular study exposed rats for 15 minutes a day for 60 days to millimeter waves. And the claim by many has been that because these have a very short wavelength, on the order of a millimeter, that they should at most affect the skin, but this assumes that you can predict the biology from the physics. And it turns out you have to actually look at the biology. And although it did affect the skin, it also affected the bone marrow and affected mitochondria in organs throughout the body, in the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidney, and the spleen. And the brain is particularly vulnerable to mitochondrial injury because it is so heavily energy demanding. It's about 2% of the body weight for non-obese individuals, but it consumes about 20 to 25% of the oxygen and 50% of the glucose for the total body. The heart is also relatively energy consuming, but not as much as the brain. So important findings from the study were that there was wide variability from animal to animal in the degree of damage, just as we see in humans. And also, the increased duration of exposure appeared to be associated with increasing problems. That is to say, this appeared to be a progressive injury problem. And this triangulates with evidence in humans, such as from the analysis by Sachikova and Glatova, which followed groups of 100 and of 150 people with microwave illness, and found that for those who were at least moderately affected, returning them to the setting in which they were re-exposed led to a course that was progressive. Next slide. So the idea that radiofrequency radiation causes toxicity is not new. Certainly by the latter 1920s, it was already being reported that subsets of individuals who were radio amateurs or shipboard radio operators were experiencing symptoms with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. By 1971, the Navy issued a report by Glaser that was updated annually through the 1970s, and the version that I happen to have is the 1972 one, by which time there were already over 2,300 citations documenting that radiofrequency radiation, this non-ionizing radiation, can adversely affect health, with whole chapters devoted to each of a number of the symptoms reported by diplomats. Then there's the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, report that emphasizes that different frequencies of radiation concurrently can have synergistic effects, and that chemicals can have synergistic effects with radiation, which we would expect because they're competing for antioxidant defenses and also they're promoting mitochondrial injury. And then the NASA report and Air Force report, and you'll notice that its title is Radiofrequency Microwave Radiation Biological Effects, and that study includes the quote, experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low-intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. So this idea that low-intensity radiofrequency radiation can have a profound effect on biology is not new. You'll hear PR claims that only, crackpots or nutcases or fringe elements believe this, but it is clear that this is something that the U.S. government has recognized in many reports over, and by the way, these are tiny fraction of available reports for many decades. Next slide. So where did the controversy come from? Given that the sounds really only match radiofrequency hearing, and given that the symptoms really only match those of non-ionizing radiation toxicity, and the signs are a match, and there's evidence of past exposure, how then could there be so much controversy? Well, one factor is that this issue can't be entirely divorced from the effects of non-ionizing radiation in the civilian sector, and this brings to the table a lucrative industry which is safe in seeking to quell concerns about the possibility of health effects, just as we used to see with tobacco. And this introduces the influence of conflict of interest in both science and other kinds of statements about the science. And I may have been the first to assemble the many different ways that conflict of interest operates to distort medical science, but this has been looked at specifically in the case of radiofrequency radiation, for example, by both Henry Wright, University of Washington, and by Huss, who found that studies that were purely funded by industry showed 1/10 the odds, 0.11, of showing health effects relative to studies that were purely funded by government or charities. Again, 1/10 the odds of showing health effects if they were funded by industry. Now, this comports with a quote from Richard Smith, the former editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, in the context of findings related to the impact of conflict of interest for a different lucrative product, which prompted him to say that, quote, far from conflict of interest being unimportant in the objective and pure world of science, where method and the quality of data is everything, it is the main factor determining the result of studies. Another source of controversy comes from the fact that, at least for those who are electrosensitive, which need not be the case, by the way, for the diplomats, they may just have toxicity rather than sensitivity. But in the case of electrosensitivity, which is used as a comparative group, concerns that these levels of radiation could produce problems are, quote, at odds with the stance of the WHO and numerous other public health bodies worldwide. Well, this is partly true and partly not. The WHO has classified radiofrequency radiation as a class 2B carcinogen, but it certainly is the case that allowable levels of radiation are allowable levels. But it should also be recognized that these regulatory and advisory groups also have abundant pressures from industry, and indeed there's abundant evidence included in the citations that conflict of interest is involved and operates to distort findings there as well. And it should also be remembered that historically there's a long lag between when, in retrospect, the evidence compellingly documented harm and when regulatory bodies act to protect the public, whether this was smoking, exposure to ionizing radiation during pregnancy, or even trans fats, which are even now just being phased out of the food supply. A third source of controversy comes from the so-called provocation studies done in people with electrosensitivity, in which they're exposed in blinded settings to non-ionizing radiation to see whether they can tell when they're being radiated or not. And guess what? They can't tell. But why should they be able to? We don't demand that for any other toxin. And the design of these studies ignores abundant evidence about the character of this problem, including evidence that variable mechanisms with different time course are involved in different individuals. Indeed, see evidence directly that there is a different time course for onset and recovery of problems in different individuals, and the fact that the body is not a meter. So an analogy, indeed more than an analogy, a homology is sunburn, which is another form of radiation-induced injury. Although it is ultraviolet radiation, which is nominally ionizing radiation, this injury is in fact produced not by ionization, but by oxidative stress and its downstream mechanism of inflammation. And it is noteworthy that the symptoms do not arise immediately when people are exposed, and the symptoms don't disappear as soon as the exposure is withdrawn. Nonetheless, people, after several cycles of exposure, correctly infer that it is the sun that is producing the problem. Now, just think for a minute, if there didn't happen to be visible redness, if it didn't happen to be the case that this is selectively affecting the skin in a place where people can see, these people, too, would be claimed to have problems that were psychogenic. The next issue is inconsistency, and we already alluded to one form of manufactured inconsistency via conflict of interest, which is a massive source of inconsistency. But there are actual inconsistencies arising from the fact that different study methodologies produce different results. And one key factor that we've mentioned a bit is time course. So different effects occur with different time courses of operation. There's also the phenomenon that we alluded to of, not with this term, of effect modification. The toxins, especially those that operate through oxidative stress and mitochondrial problems, have high what's called effect modification, meaning widely different effects from individual to individual, and part through the phenomenon of oxidative preconditioning that we mentioned. But also it is the case that the characteristics of the exposure matter a lot in determining the results of studies. Characteristics that are present in real-world man-made radiation exposure, such as pulsation, modulation, and intermittency, that is to say various time courses of variability, as well as polarization, are associated with increased biological effects. And in fact, as Panagopoulos stated, quote, while experimental studies employing simulated EMF emissions present a strong inconsistency among their results, with less than 50% of them reporting effects, studies employing real mobile phone exposures demonstrate an almost 100% consistency in showing adverse effects. Now, I should comment that this could be viewed as a challenge once this has been published, and it would be very easy to design a negative study. Indeed, it's very easy to design negative studies in general, and the provocation studies seem to have been designed to be negative, but nonetheless, that observation in the current literature is very relevant. Next slide. And other sources of controversy can be just filter the word PR, and if you look at the PR literature, there's a common reference to the so-called 4Ds. Exactly which D words these are varies from source to source, but they're commonly deny, delay, dismiss, and discredit. And we can see examples of the first three of these Ds, including some, what should be reputable sources like IEEE Spectrum. RF is non-ionizing radiation. Okay, so far so good. It is not the kind of radiation that could damage DNA and cause cancer. Well, that does not follow. In fact, I've included a citation to Henry Ly's study showing that radiofrequency radiation causes both single and double-stranded DNA breaks. And also, I've mentioned that the World Health Organization classifies radiofrequency radiation as a class 2B carcinogen. Or, quote, for RFR, there is no known plausible biophysical mechanism of action for harm. Well, there's a mechanism that's not only plausible, but as we've shown, abundantly replicated and triangulated, specifically oxidative stress. Or the claim that the weight of the evidence shows no risk. Well, which weight of evidence? Certainly Yakimenko's weight of evidence with 93 out of 100 studies showed that there was a risk. Certainly Henry Ly's analysis of non-industry funded studies, which found that 70% of them found a problem, shows that the weight of the evidence shows there's a problem. And Panagopoulos' observation that if you focus on studies that use real-world radiation, almost universally they show a problem. These all show that the weight of the relevant evidence abundantly documents that there is a risk. And finally, there's the fourth D, which is discredit. And up at discredit, individuals raising concerns about lucrative products, as we see again and again, employ a common, relatively stereotyped lexicon. These often involve extremely good quality writing, because of course they're able to pay good quality writers to write these pieces, but with verbiage such as conspiracy, fringe, nutcase, pseudoscience, junk science, low quality, ignorance, cherry picking, scaremongering, as well as with common use of the talking points like that, this is non-ionizing radiation that can't cause harm, even though surely the, individuals are aware that that isn't true. or that, this defies scientific consensus. Well, first of all, there isn't any scientific consensus that has ever been formally evaluated. But the only scientists that would be relevant to such a consensus are certainly not the parties that serve on advisory boards, many of whom are not the scientists who actually work with us, but the scientists who study biological effects of radiofrequency radiation. And according to Leonard Herdal, one such scientist in Sweden, the scientists who actually study this have a scientific consensus that there is a problem. Incidentally, that quote stated without irony, first attempting to circumvent scientific consensus with scaremongering, and then having appealed to consensus, which is like to petition, they then say science is not conducted by petition or arguments to authority. These also make heavy use of the so-called third-party technique, which we learn about again and again in the discovery process and litigation against companies that produce products that have potential to cause harm. And we've seen this, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry with abundant evidence of massive ghostwriting efforts in which often academics, including highly reputable academics, are willing to be listed as the author, first author, or sole author on papers that are produced by industry or by PR firms that work for them. And the same is true for journalists who are often willing to quote byline unquote articles produced by industry. And it should be also be mentioned that noble-sounding nonprofits with names like the American Council of Science and Health or the Science Literacy Project often receive funding from entities like the tobacco, pharmaceutical, and chemical industry, and then put out pieces claiming that concerns about the associated products constitute scaremongering or fearmongering. Next slide. And I'll take a minute to mention the issue of psychogenic illness, because this has come up again and again, both in the setting of diplomats and in the setting of electrosensitivity. Psychogenic illness under its various aliases, whether it's mass hysteria or functional illness or et cetera. And psychogenic illness has its origins in, if not before Freud, and whereas much of the rest of the mythologies produced by Freud have successfully understood to have been discredited, somehow this doesn't seem to have actually ever been formally debunked, and has a particular legacy in the fields of psychiatry and neurology. The problem with psychogenic explanations is by explaining everything, they explain nothing. It's tantamount to saying that God did it or witches did it. And in fact, the standard of evidence that is often made use of by those who are propounding psychogenic theories is often very different for organic and psychogenic causes. Organic causes meaning those with a physiological basis. For physiologically based causes, the standard is often absence of proof constitutes proof of absence, having not really looked for proof or used sort of false evidence like we saw with the provocation studies to discredit. But for psychogenic causes, suggestion suffices for proof. There's no demand for specificity, triangulation, dose response, or any of the other things that we demand for organic causes. Yes? Yes. I've got, if you like, I can just cut off the psychogenic part, and if people have additional questions related to that, we can take that in questions. And then after that, I just have one wrap-up slide. Do you want me to just go directly to the wrap-up slide? All right. Okay, next slide. Alternative hypotheses. So how does this stack up against alternative hypotheses when considered in relation to the specifics of the noises heard, the symptoms reported, quantitatively as well as qualitatively, the signs precedent for use in past U.S. diplomats and foreign embassy settings, and known biological mechanism that can explain not only the symptoms and signs, but biological mechanism that can produce the characteristics of the noises heard? And the answer is that all of these are specific fits for RF. None are a fit in any of these cells for any of the other hypotheses that have been tendered. There are certainly partial fits for some of the other cells, such as sonic hypotheses can explain noise, but not noise with these characteristics. And chemical hypotheses are responsible for biological mechanisms that can produce these symptoms, but not in this distribution, and not the noises that are heard. So really, it is only the case that pulsed RF, which is a fit for every one of these cells, is a fit, and therefore, in my view, this essentially compels the conclusion that pulse radiofrequency radiation is the cause. Next slide. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.